Зараз я з великим задоволенням хотів би надати слово нашому партнеру Кеннету МакДонагу, який представляє Інститут центральноєвропейської політики СЕПІ Словаччина, який буде виступати на тему військове співробітництво України, ЄС та НАТО. Ну, це вже буде погляд, так мовити, з зовнішньої сторони. Будь ласка, пане Кеннете.
Thank you, Igor. Right, so we began this paper. We began this paper in September, October of last year, and our part of the paper at CEPI in Bratislava was to look at the level of cooperation in the security area between the EU and Ukraine, and this is the area I've been working on. When we started in October, that seemed a very relevant question. By the time we began drafting it, towards the end of November, December, it seemed to have become a less relevant question. And then by the time we were submitting and completing the paper in February, it had become relevant again. The more recent events in Crimea, first of all, and then in eastern Ukraine, highlight some of the limits of the EU as a security actor, as a guarantor of security towards Ukraine, particularly the limits of coordinating EU action among the 28 member states, the different national objectives, and the unwillingness, I suppose, to take a very firm and strong stand, at least in short order. So that's sort of the caveat of this presentation. As we've heard in the first part of the presentation, which forms part of this analytical paper, cooperation between Ukraine and NATO has been ongoing for just over 20 years, and with the EU it's been going on for approximately 10 years, formally since 2005, and then slowly and tentatively continuing. There has been some successes, albeit some modest ones, but perhaps critically for current circumstances, in other political crises that have occurred in this period, the cooperation has also continued. So it has been relatively robust to changes in government within Ukraine. And we see this happening again today. NATO in March, the working groups that were mentioned by Hannah, have relaunched and reinvigorated their approach, focusing on very specific issues. And the EU itself has announced a financial aid package and the unilateral removal of certain trade barriers as a way of sort of stepping up association and integration. So this paper looks at what has been achieved to date and then speculates what might happen in the future in terms of EU and Ukraine cooperation, specifically in the area of security and defence. So the record to date has shown that Ukraine has been one of the most active non-member states and members of the Eastern Partnership in CSTP missions over the past decade. Its involvement comes as part of a special framework for cooperation agreement that was established, as I mentioned, in 2005, and that mirrors similar agreements with the United States, with Canada, and it has to be mentioned with Russia as well. Interestingly, that particular agreement with Russia was not one of the areas that was reviewed by the European Council in March, so it still stands. As I mentioned, Ukraine's involvement has extended to an involvement in 3 separate missions, 1 battle group, and it's also been the recipient essentially of one of the missions. So the first is a EU police mission in Bosnia-Herzegovina, a further police mission in the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, the UNAVFOR mission operating in the Red Sea with headquarters in Northwood in London, and it's also been involved in a Greek-led battle group, sometimes called the Balkan Battle Group. It also has an acronym which I'll leave out for now. And there is some suggestion that it would participate in the V4-led battle group due to come into service in 2016. The EU has also been engaged in a border assistance mission on the Ukrainian-Moldovan border. And this cooperation, as I mentioned, continued despite various changes from Yushchenko to Yanukovych to the current interim administration as well. One other area of cooperation that's worth mentioning, although it was discussed as part of the association agreement, which is now perhaps coming back online, the June 2013 EU-Ukraine Cooperation Council, which was facilitating the association agreement, resolved to encourage and facilitate direct cooperation on concrete activities between relevant Ukrainian institutions and CFSP, CSDP institutions, such as the European Defence Agency. So there's a potential for practical procurement cooperation in the area of military technology. The EU conclusions in March restated the EU's offer of the association agreement, so that is back on the table after the recent events, but it remains to be seen how quickly that can be moved forward. So what I'd like to go through now are some details on each of the individual missions before drawing some general conclusions about the status of Ukraine-EU cooperation, and how that links back into the question of Ukraine-NATO cooperation as well. So first of all, there's the EU Border Assistance Mission in Moldova, Ukraine. It's been in place since 2005 on an annual budget of approximately 21 or 22 million, on a program budget of about 21 million for a 3-year program, so about 8 million per year, and it's aimed at technical and training of Ukrainian and Moldovan border officials, over 7,000 of whom have received such training, and 300 officials have spent time in EU member states observing best practice on border control and customs control. One significant part of this mission that's worth mentioning now is it was useful for countering Russian claims of a blockade affecting Transnistria and Moldova. The Border Assistance Mission was able to confirm that the border remained open throughout this period. Moving on to the policing missions, one in Bosnia-Herzegovina from 2003 to 2012 and another in Macedonia from 2003 to 2005. Again, Ukraine contributed in a rather more modest way, around 5 or 6 personnel on an annual basis, as well as contributing €25,000 per year to the annual budgets. And again, particularly the Bosnia mission continued throughout the Orange Revolution period. So it sort of started in 2003 and has continued right up until 2012 when the entire mission itself was disbanded. It's worth mentioning these police missions in particular in that they were involving Ukrainian police personnel in providing best practice and training in these countries in the former Yugoslavia. And there's currently a proposal being tabled led by the British, the Polish and the Swedes at EU level for a similar type mission to take place in Ukraine and to deploy over the next number of months. Now, it's still a tentative proposal. It's yet to make it onto the agenda of the Foreign Ministers' Council, but there are certain powerful countries pushing for that. And that would interestingly place, I suppose, EU-flagged officials on Ukrainian territory, which may have implications for defence and security. My colleague Hannah already mentioned the involvement of the Ukrainian Navy in Operation Ocean Shield, the counter-piracy mission led by NATO in the Red Sea. Following on from the second Natchez deployment under that operation, it immediately joined the UNAVFOR operation, the Atalanta mission off the Red Sea led by the EU, and spent January and February of 2014 as part of that mission. In addition to that, Ukraine has also contributed staff officers to the operational headquarters in Northwood in the UK, and staff officers to the force headquarters, which have been located on board the various force flagships since 2010. So it's been an ongoing cooperation over 4 or 5 years now, and is one that's likely to continue into the foreseeable future. The other area of security cooperation between an EU institution and Ukraine is the battle group formations. The idea behind the battle groups is, of course, that the EU would have a standing force ready to deploy to respond to emergency situations. The requirement is to have 2 such battle groups ready to deploy in any circumstance. Although they've been around for quite some time now, no battle group is ever deployed. So that's worth keeping in mind. That said, they do provide an important area for developing interoperability, for developing cooperation, and for sharing knowledge among European and, in certain cases, non-European militaries. Ukraine became the first non-EU member state to join a battle group and join in the Balkan battle group, led by Greece and made up also of Bulgaria, Romania and Cyprus. Its contribution involved a Marine Corps company, an IL-76 plane with crew, and again a number of staff officers to the battle group headquarters, previously located in Larissa in Greece. One controversy on this, and this perhaps speaks to the question of NATO membership, is how can Ukraine as a formerly non-aligned country involve itself in battle groups? But it can point to the active involvement of other neutral and non-aligned EU member states, such as Ireland, Austria and Sweden, in the battle group formations. There's also, of course, the possibility that Ukraine may consider revisiting its non-aligned status in light of recent events, and that shouldn't be entirely discounted. Sweden, for example, is doing so as we speak. In terms of future cooperation, the Greek-led battle group is due to come back into operation, I think, in 2016, if I'm not entirely mistaken, and it was due to begin force preparation in 2014, although that obviously has been somewhat thrown off course by events in Crimea. The Marine Corps were previously based in Feodosia, and obviously have other issues on their mind rather than preparing for EU battle groups. There's also an open door waiting for Ukraine if it wishes to participate in the V4 battle group, which is due to come online shortly. They've identified Ukraine as a potential partner to fill a particular gap in their capacity, the airlift capacity, and they see are very open to that cooperation, very keen to pursue it, and even more so in light of recent events. So in terms of certain conclusions, as the rapid pace of events in recent weeks have demonstrated, neither NATO nor the EU can really sit back and wait for events to continue to evolve. Russian actions that have continued from Crimea onwards are shaping the agenda in new and worrying ways, and NATO and the EU really need to take immediate concrete actions to begin to shape outcomes themselves in Ukraine. The NATO-Ukraine Commission have met and are working on concrete proposals for continued cooperation that will hopefully produce tangible results, particularly the working group initiatives on defence planning and policy, armaments and capacity building, and also demonstrating support for the benefits of this cooperation. NATO can assist domestic actors win arguments in favour of a Western turn. The European Council has met on several times, beginning in March, to discuss loans and other forms of financial assistance. An effort should really be stepped up to bring Ukraine into the V4 battle group, even if the financial circumstances make this difficult. NATO and EU have been remarkably successful in integrating other Central and Eastern European states into their organisations, with various benefits that have accrued to that, and the continuation of that success is indeed possible with Ukraine, but requires greater political will and vision than we have seen to date. So in terms of the recommendations in the summary of the report, the future of defence cooperation between Ukraine, NATO, V4 and the EU is heavily dependent on political outcomes of current events. However, regardless, the objective underlying security needs remain. Areas around border management, airlift capacity, securing shipping routes, these remain objective security challenges for which continued cooperation will be beneficial, regardless of the political direction any of the actors take. The report also recommends the EU and NATO should increase efforts to reach out and support the new Ukrainian government in the run-up to and after the elections. Support should focus in the short term on very tangible achievements, such as financial assistance, technical advice, defence planning and technical achievements. But there's also the recommendation that the EU and NATO should open negotiations with the new government on further integration, even if that is short of ultimate membership. Regarding the V4, and speaking with my Slovak hat on, there's a real need for the Visegrad 4 region to speak with one voice in support of Ukraine, and it's worrying that it has failed to do so to date, Slovakia in particular being something of a laggard on this. The current crisis brings Russian power to the doorsteps of 3 of the V4 states, and this new reality needs to be recognised and responded to. The V4 need to advocate for a strong response to the Russian violation of the 1994 Budapest Memorandum, because the guarantee of Ukrainian territorial integrity, if that is not enforced, it perhaps raises questions about Article 5 under the NATO Charter, losing some of its power as a deterrent. And that's a real issue for those who find themselves on the borders of the European Union and NATO membership. Just returning to some of the issues around the CSDP slightly more generally, the EU has a very mixed record in achievements in areas of security cooperation. It is a very diverse organisation that tends towards incoherence and inaction, and also tends to underfund its security objectives. Therefore, we shouldn't be surprised that its involvement with Ukraine to date has been less than exemplary, and we should probably call on the EU member states to perhaps recognise the return of hard security challenges, which they have been trying to avoid for the last 20 years or so. So I'll finish with that.
Спасибі велике. Ми прослухали 2 доповіді. Одна, так мовити, показала українську перспективу, одна, з іншого боку, ми мали перспективу за кордону. Значить, у нас є час на запитання і відповідь або на якісь короткі коментарі. Хто хотів би розпочати? Коротенько, а тоді
Віктор Лисицький, дуже коротко. Ви знаєте, мені здається, що НАТО, Європейський Союз, ну і НАТО, зрозуміла річ, вони не враховують деякі дуже важливі речі. Росія продемонструвала, на превеликий жаль, що вона може дуже швидко забути свою власну історію. Норми міжнародного права для неї так це якась абстракція, там где-то для кого-то написано, там для Сирії, там для Зімбабве, може бути, але не для нас. І вона просто не знає фундаментальних тенденцій розвитку суспільства. Ну от якщо говорити про власну історію. Росія виштовхнула фактично нас із РСР своїм першим актом, який вони прийняли ще 12 червня 90-го року. Цей акт назывался «Декларация про государственный суверенитет Российской Советской Федеративной Социалистической Республики». 12 июня. Это был первый документ, который народні депутати Росії прийняли на своєму першому з'їзді, який вони проводили після перших демократичних виборів, точніше після других. Перші були в 89-му, це були другі демократичні вибори. Вони це прийняли, вони там в цій декларації про Крим не згадували. І про Донецьку, і про Схід наш. Вони не згадували це навіть коли підписували Біловежську угоду і таке інше, і таке інше. Знаєте? Вони зараз самі не полюбляють згадувати 12 червня 90-го року. Не згадують, вони перестали його святкувати. Знаєте? І зараз вони фактично попрали свої собственні рішення, анексували Крим і щось схоже збираються зробити на Сході. І саме тому оцінювати перспективи входження в НАТО, України в НАТО, треба виходити з того, що Росія продемонструвала всьому світові. Ну весь світ це бачить. Я намагаюся дивитися там кілька англомовних каналів, ну все говорять одне і те ж саме. Ну, що Deutsche Welle, що CNN, все приблизно одне і те ж саме говорять. Вона продемонструвала своєму світу, що вона мала в виду все мировое сообщество. Для нее оно не существует. Понимаете? І саме тому питання вступу України в НАТО треба розглядати саме під цим кутом. Тому що якщо так буде, якщо її не зупинити Росії, то прийдеться її зупиняти де-небудь на станції ЧОП на угорському кордоні.
Так.
Дякую.
Да, дякую, Віктор Іванович, за нагадування. Дійсно, ми дуже часто забуваємо історію, але ми бачимо, що дуже часто історію переглядають. Да? Пан Сунгоровський, будь ласка.
У меня 3 коротких вопроса ко второму докладчику. На самом деле сейчас НАТО делает, и Европейский Союз делают в принципе все возможное в рамках существующих механизмов, которые предусмотрены и их уставами, и их договорами, и договорами между Украиной. Но сейчас время, скажем так, нестандартных подходов, поиска нестандартных вот именно подходов. Почему? Потому что эти механизмы в принципе себя исчерпали. И вот как первый докладчик у нас сказал, что вот не ощущается вот той доданной вартости, что же можно добавить. В этом плане у меня 3 вопроса. Почему, скажем, нельзя вернуться к практике, которая использовалась в первые годы сотрудничества Украины с НАТО, а именно, когда сюда заходят войска для участия в международных учениях, а после учений, забывают здесь свое вооружение и технику и уходят без нее. Это прямое оказание, скажем, военно-технической помощи. Во-вторых, в 2011 году уже с 2011 года, в принципе, действует протокол между Украиной и ЕС о участии Украины в программах 20 европейских агентств, в том числе и по вопросам безопасности. Единственным, скажем так, препятствием для участия вот именно в военных проектах это является упоминание о том, что в них участвуют только члены НАТО. Почему бы его не исключить для Украины? Сочувствующий, да. Да, почему? Потому что с этой оговоркой резко снижается эффективность и вообще простор для кооперации оборонно-промышленных предприятий Украины со своими европейскими партнерами. И третье. Насколько высоко вы оцениваете, скажем, эффективность тех инициатив по направлению в Украину миссий, в том числе и ЕС, с точки зрения необходимости принятия Еврокомиссии Common Action, документа об общих действиях? Тем более, что по чувствительным вопросам общей безопасности они, как правило, принимаются в рамках резолюции Совета Безопасности ООН, где Россия является членом. Спасибо.
Так, пане Кеннет, у вас є можливість відповісти на всі питання за НАТО. Да? Будь ласка. On behalf of NATO.
It's very unusual to be an Irishman asked to speak for NATO. So on the first point, on history, I think that's a very important and a valid point, particularly this 1990 date and the idea of forgotten history, but I think we all know the story of nationalism and who gets to write certain histories. I think there is a growing realization among certain NATO member states, and the V4, Poland in particular, recognize the exceptional nature of the challenge that's now being faced. But I think other member states are slower to recognize this change, Germany in particular. And I think that's why a path to membership isn't being accelerated. I don't think there's the political will among all member states. I don't think there's the same level of recognition of what the challenge is by all member states. And unfortunately, I'm not that optimistic that that will change very quickly unless there's some very dramatic events in the short term. Moving on to the second question, second three questions. Again, I'd agree that we're in unusual times, or interesting times perhaps to phrase it one way, and that non-standard options should perhaps be considered. But again, and I think in some ways it goes back, certainly for the first two questions, the answer is the same, and it's rather similar to the answer I'm providing to Victor, that not all member states agree on how exceptional the times are. Not all member states are willing to engage in what they would view to be provocative towards Russia gestures by providing direct military support. And again, the prospects for that changing are quite limited. Now, unilaterally or bilaterally that may occur. The United States have upped their rhetoric certainly over the recent weeks, and the recent visit by John Brennan from the CIA suggests that there are certain bilateral steps that could be taken towards those ends, but I wouldn't anticipate those changes happening in the short term at the EU or NATO organizational level. On the third question and the problem of the UNSC, yes, I think it's certainly a valid point about the limited nature of European deployments under CSTP. To date, they've all followed or occurred under UN Security Council mandates, and there's a big and obvious flaw in relation to that. And we come to dealing with the situation in Ukraine that certainly Russia will veto, and at best China will abstain. Again, in the short term, given the different strategic cultures in the European Union, particularly the non-aligned and neutral states, I can't see that changing from the CSTP perspective, and that the EU, and this is one of the issues, that the policing mission that I mentioned and being proposed by the Swedes, the British and the Polish may founder on this issue, that it won't be able to take place, although they may be able to argue that if the acting government invite them in, that may give sufficient legitimacy for a mandate for those non-aligned member states. But it's a serious weakness in the EU's ability to operate internationally, that you have this divergent strategic cultures, and particularly this clash between EU member states who are members of NATO and EU member states who are not members of NATO. One convenient fig leaf for that is the Cyprus-Turkish tensions, which are usually wheeled out. But I suspect even if they were resolved in the morning, you'd still have these dynamics at the EU level.
Спасибі велике. Я хотів би надати слово Вадиму Олександровичу. Репліку. Да, будь ласка, да, тільки коротко. А тоді ще буде...
Буквально 5 секунд. По поводу провоцирования России. И НАТО, и всем остальным, скажем, странам давно пора понять, что Россию провоцирует само существование НАТО, независимой Украины. И поэтому разговоры о каких-то дополнительных, скажем, там, попытках Украины вступить в НАТО, ну это они просто смешно выглядят, понимаете, это...